Okay, today we conclude on what has ended up being a 5-part series on persecution. We have just a few more points to cover on this subject, and as announced last Sunday, hopefully we'll have time for questions at the end. I don't know whether I should use hopefully or not, but we may have time. And questions can sometimes go really well, and other times not so much, so we'll see. All right, you might remember last Sunday's sermon that I referred to a bill being proposed in New York that would require 5th graders to be taught the differences between cisgender, transgender, gender non-binary, gender expansive, and gender identity. This so that they could decide for themselves which of these options they would want to pursue for their own personal lifestyle. Now, we're talking now about 5th graders. Remember that story? All right, and I complained that I didn't even know what some of those terms even meant, especially cisgender, and made the comment that it sounded like something really nasty, something that would probably not be appropriate to even define in church. Remember me talking about that? So later in the afternoon, I decided to cautiously look up the meaning, fearing that I might stumble into something really dark and perverted. And I had a good laugh, a really good laugh with Terry, actually, when I read the definition. It simply means that you identify with the sex that you are born with. And a man who is born a man and identifies as a man is a cisgender. Same for a woman. And so of all those words, the one used for, this is the one used for those who are normal. And probably everyone here knew that. And everyone probably thought I was a real dork when I was carrying on about how creepy the word is, but it's still a creepy sounding word. And so apparently last Sunday, a cisgender who didn't know he was a cisgender was addressing a group of cisgenders that he didn't know were cisgenders, complaining about the word cisgender. So the whole thing was comical to me. And I can now be hip and trendy and tell others that my gender identity is cisgender. All right, but I won't. Because the word, when you think about it, is really a disgusting word after all. And why is it disgusting? Well, because the LGBT crowd is determined to do away with any idea that there is a normal gender identity. And so they've replaced the word normal with one of their own made-up words in order to advance this perverted concept that everyone is on this gender spectrum. And cisgender, then, is just one of many normals, equal to transgender and gender non-binary and so on. So it's a devious propaganda tactic and part of Satan's ongoing agenda of deconstructing reality. So a few more troublesome events have transpired since last time we met. Visitors getting maybe a little bit of a disadvantage because this is closely tied into what we covered last week. But we've had a few events just in this last week, and I've collected some more headlines that show how our culture is pushing all of us into accepting same-sex relationships, into accepting abortion, transgenderism, and so on as normal, healthy, and wholesome. And that the government itself is willing to do its part in forcing this on us as well. Some of these stories you're probably going to be aware of if you're following along in the news and that sort of thing, especially with Christian sources. Amazon is now removing all books that frame transgender and other LGBT identities as a mental illness or anything other than normal. Earlier this week, the 7th Circuit Court, I got something turned around. Okay. It's not like we ever have technology problems here. Well, maybe it didn't get included. Forget you saw that one. Earlier this week, the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals reaffirmed its previous ruling that struck down a law here in Indiana. The law required parents to be informed before their underage daughter has an abortion. Sexual abusers have been known to take their young victims to abortion clinics to cover up rape and pregnancy, and one of the purposes of that law is to help prevent that. However, who do you think opposed it? Planned Parenthood argued that the requirements are burdensome, and 2 of the 3 7th Circuit judges agreed. Isn't that amazing? All right, a Roman Catholic priest in Argentina has performed a Catholic marriage for 2 homosexuals, one of whom is a transgender woman. The ceremony was composed of Bible readings, a homily, a profession of vows, and Holy Communion to the pair and to their guests. The wedding was not officially recognized by the Catholic Church, but no action has been taken against the priest. And related to this, a group of priests in Austria have stated this week that they will defy the Vatican's recent decree in forbidding priests from blessing same-sex couples. Celebrating their 80th anniversary, Marvel Comics will release a new limited series that will include a gay superhero to mark Pride Month, a new Captain America. A spokesman stated, Marvel Comics is proud to honor Pride Month with the rise of this new LGBTQ plus hero. The character is inspired by heroes of the queer community, activists, leaders, and everyday folks pushing for a better life. Again, this is all just since last Sunday. A father in Canada who has long objected to his 14-year-old daughter taking testosterone as part of an experimental gender transition has been jailed in British Columbia for contempt of court. Apparently, the father was ordered to not go public with his opposition, which he did, and was ordered to not refer to his daughter as a daughter and to not use feminine pronouns like she and her, which he also did, and was therefore arrested for contempt of court. The father's ex-wife, who is supported by the Canadian medical and legal system, is proceeding with their child's transitioning against his wishes. A local psychologist advised the daughter to take testosterone, and when the father contested the matter in court, the judge at the time told him that his consent was not relevant and that if he did not affirm her as a male, he would be implicated in the criminal offense of, quote, family violence. The father has gone to the public expressing his concern, saying, since she can never go back to being a girl in the healthy body that she should have had, she's going to forever have a lower voice. She'll forever shave because of facial hair. She won't be able to have children. My child's life is ruined. And that got him in trouble. At least one news reporter is now urging journalists to stop using the term biological males, claiming that it is a serious anti-trans slur that is hateful to use. And starting this week, the city of Cambridge, Massachusetts, home of Harvard University, is officially recognizing polyamory by amending the city's existing statute so that domestic partnerships are not limited to only 2 people. And going back to Canada, in a town called Regina, the local LGBTQ community has filed a human rights complaint against Victory Church. Within 2 days, more than 840 people signed on to the application as well, becoming co-plaintiffs. In his sermon, the pastor criticized the aggressive efforts of the LGBT movement in pursuing the youth and stated that transgenderism at a young age is a form of child abuse. And like all sermons, the church actually posted it on their website, where the leader of the local LGBT group found it. Here's a picture of him. And businesses all across town this week have been flying pride flags to protest the church and support the legal action against it. All right, so we are finding ourselves more and more at odds with the world we live in. Indeed, as we've been saying in this series, conflict is inevitable for the one who strives to live by God's righteous standards. The righteousness that Jesus preached and demanded his followers to live out is a righteousness that the world just despises, rejects, and hates. And the more depraved the culture is, the greater the conflict, the greater the resistance, and the harsher the backlash toward those who refuse to go along with its depravity. Last week, we talked about the various ways we should be preparing for what lies ahead, whether the hardship is relatively minor or intense, soon or far off. There are things that we can and should be doing even now in getting ourselves ready. It's not too early to be doing that or to be entering into these sorts of discussions. First is that we need to embrace a biblical attitude about both hardship and persecution. Just to kind of review what we've covered so far, the scriptures have a lot to say about both of these subjects, and what they say, of course, has to be our starting point. Secondly, our ultimate hope has to be in God and His provision, not in our own resources and planning and stockpiles. Certainly, we need to be taking responsible measures, like getting out of debt and stocking up supplies and provisions and relying less on the system. But as Paul told Timothy, our earthly wealth and resources are, quote, uncertain. That's a key word there. God, however, isn't uncertain, and therefore should be the object of our hope and trust. Third, we should even now be forming a habit of standing up for Christ. If we aren't willing to suffer now when the cost is relatively low, then we won't be willing to suffer later when the cost is high. And next, very important, we need to be plugged into a local church family where we can all bear each other's burdens, stand with each other, support each other, and hold each other accountable so that no one will compromise and give up in the midst of hardship, which will be a great temptation. And we spent a lot of time on this one in particular. And for today, I have one more point to add to our list here of preparing, and that would be sowing and reaping. Excuse me. And I feel very strongly about this one and place it on the same level as all the others. Now, this phrase, sowing and reaping, and even the principle itself, as you know, has been abused and dragged through the mud by prosperity preachers who use it to bilk people out of money. But the principle itself, of course, is a biblical one, and we should not avoid it or belittle it or shy away from it. It is a principle that can be applied to many areas of our lives, including the one that we are now talking about. There are investments we can make now when we are not under fire that will pay off later when we are under fire. And there are, of course, no absolute guarantees. Every situation is different. But all through the scriptures, we are presented with this divine principle that God blesses those who bless others. We all know that to be true. We've all read that. We've all have heard sermons on this. If you help someone who is in need, you can expect help when you are in need. And so along this line, one of the ways of preparing for the future is to use the words of Jesus, is to store up treasure in heaven. For example, there are today fellow brothers and sisters in the Lord who take a stand for Christ and are suffering for it. We may not know them personally, but we know of them, and we are one with them in Christ. Most are overseas, living in countries hostile to the gospel. We talk about them here on Sunday mornings often. But some are here in the States, under attack for living out their Christian convictions here. The scriptures, of course, call on us to remember them, to stand with those who are being mistreated for the sake of the gospel and the name of Christ. And so part of this reaping and sowing would be to invest in measures to help bear their burden, like calling attention to what they were going through and pondering their suffering, like we do in the persecution reports, for instance, and praying for them and supporting ministries that strive to help them and taking other measures to advocate for them. Christians in northern Korea, Iran, Iraq, China, Nigeria, Syria, Afghanistan, and many more countries deal with hardships and challenges that we can't even begin to fathom. And we are called to suffer with those who suffer. And even here in the States, we see things ramping up all the time. Immediately what comes to mind are the Christian bakers and photographers and florists and wedding coordinators who have been the target of LGBT activists for refusing to endorse same-sex weddings with their services. And then we have Sandra Merritt and David Deladin, who, as you may remember, went undercover to expose Planned Parenthood for selling fetal tissue and organs from aborted babies. Both have been in very intense legal battles during the last couple of years here in both criminal and civil courts. In fact, a civil court recently awarded Planned Parenthood $16 million in their lawsuit against these two pro-lifers. And one way to help those under attack is to support organizations that provide legal services for Christians coming under fire. And there are a number of them, and our church supports one of them. The point is, we shouldn't be waiting to step up as when there are situations that hit closer to home, like friends, family, church members, and so on. There are situations even now where these exhortations in the New Testament that you see here that we've been covering should be acted upon by all of us. And on this, I would take us back to that passage in 2 Corinthians we looked at earlier in this series. There, as you will remember, Paul is exhorting the Christians to help out believers in Jerusalem who were suffering continuing poverty. Upon conversion, some believers in that city had lost their jobs, and some suffered other economic hardships, and there was a shortage of food going on at the time because of an intense famine in the area. All around, times were really tough. And toward the end of his exhortation in that letter there, in making the case and why they should step in and help them, he says, "Our desire is not that others might be relieved while you are hard-pressed, but that there might be equality. At the present time, your plenty will supply what they need, so that in turn, their plenty will supply what you need." You catch that? At the present time, your plenty will supply what they need, so that in turn, their plenty will supply what you need. Now, Paul is not actually predicting, future prosperity in Jerusalem and future poverty in Corinth. Rather, since our future financial conditions for all of us are so uncertain, a complete reversal in the situation would not be inconceivable. But if the Corinthians, who now have plenty to share, will now become givers, this will play a major role in them becoming receivers if the day of poverty were to ever come upon them. And so likewise, if you and I are helping to bear the burdens of others and sharing with God's people who are in need and remembering those who are mistreated and suffering with those who suffer and interceding for brothers and sisters who are under attack, then by that our plenty will supply what they need, so that in turn God, through the plenty of others, will, when the day comes, supply what we need. Sowing and reaping, storing up capital in the treasury above. Essentially, there are ways that we can, even now, be investing in the welfare of our own futures. Okay, so that now concludes the part on preparing ourselves for what lies ahead. Let's now turn our attention. We got demons in our slideshow. That's all I can say. Let's now turn our attention to something different. Our persecutors, those who mistreat and persecute us. How should we respond to them? In some ways, this question would warrant a whole separate 5-part series. In other ways, probably really not that much actually needs to be said because, well, we've covered this before. And from your own reading of the New Testament and other teachings you've received, everyone knows full well what is expected of us, which is this: do good to those who hate you. Does that sound familiar? Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who mistreat you. Aren't those lovely words? Don't we just welcome them so endearingly? If someone slaps you on the cheek, turn to them the other also. If someone takes your coat, do not withhold your shirt from them. So it's pretty clear, when mistreated, we are not to reciprocate, but rather respond in ways altogether unlike the ways that we are being treated. Enemies are to be loved, haters are to be treated with goodness, oppressors are to be blessed, persecutors are to be prayed for, and so on. So from the Sermon on the Mount, the Sermon on the Plain, Matthew 5 and Luke 6, if you love those who love you, well, so what, Jesus says. Even tax collectors do that. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. Romans 12, do not repay evil for evil. If it is possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. Do not take revenge. Leave room for God's wrath. It is written, it is mine to avenge. I will repay, says the Lord. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. 1 Peter 2, to this you were called because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. When they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. And the next chapter, in verse 9 of 3, do not repay evil with evil or insult with insult. On the contrary, repay evil with blessing, because to this you were called, so that you may inherit a blessing. And notice these words that Paul wrote to the Corinthians. To this very hour we go hungry and thirsty, we are in rags, we are brutally beaten, we are homeless, we work hard with our hands. When we are cursed, we bless. When we are persecuted, we endure it. When we are slandered, we answer kindly. We have become the scum of the earth, the garbage of the world, right up to the very present moment. So, of course, all this is very unnatural for us. When we are the object of malicious attack, our first response is to fight back, get nasty, get even, certainly not to forgive or to bless them or to pray for them. All this sounds good on a sermon on Sunday morning or on paper or when you're reading it in the Bible for yourself, but when you're in the heat of the moment, it's not what we are inclined to do. And the only way that we can do what the Lord calls on us to do is, of course, by His help, because the psychological drive to strike back is overwhelmingly strong, thus the need for His grace in those situations. But it does start with an act of the will. I will be merciful, even if I don't feel like it. Now, the focus of these verses is specifically on retaliation, paying back evil with evil. They are not addressing, for instance, defending yourself from violence or harm from someone who might, for instance, lunge at you with a knife. And that's an altogether different subject and not really part of our subject at hand. But just to keep this distinction in mind, self-defense is different than retaliation or revenge. Intent here is everything. For today, the takeaway is do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who mistreat you. And Jesus, of course, is our example in this, especially in his prayer, Father, forgive them. And we have examples all through church history of martyrs and confessors who have responded in a similar way. All right, moving on to the next point for this morning. Oh, I should have brought that up earlier. Okay, if you're taking notes, you need to write really fast. I'll leave it up there for a moment. So let's now talk about options that we might have or might not have when faced with persecution. And here I'm not talking about the milder forms like insults and harassment, but the heavier stuff, threats of long imprisonment, confiscation of property, of homes, perhaps death. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because the focus of this series hasn't been on this level of hardship, which I maintain is still quite a ways off. But as we anticipate what might eventually come our way, it's probably not too early to at least get the discussion started on what could be part of the plan. So far in this series, the exhortation has been to endure, to suffer through it, and to do so honorably, knowing that suffering for the kingdom of God is, in the scriptures, to be regarded as a blessing, a privilege that will result in great reward. But there is also, when things get really tough, another option that the Bible allows for, and that is the option of fleeing, of packing up and running off to somewhere safe. And this itself is a form of hardship, leaving behind homes, jobs, possessions, maybe family members, friends, a whole way of life, but it may prove in some situations to be the better choice. Again, the scriptures certainly allow for this. When Jesus sent out the 12 in Matthew 10, he told them, "You will be hated by everyone because of me. When you are persecuted in one place, flee to another." And from this, we can gather that a Christian is not obligated before God to offer up his own head on the platter, so to speak. We shouldn't look for opportunities to be abused or mistreated, or willingly walk into them, nor are we expected to not seek relief and protection from hostility when we can. Because here, Jesus clearly tells his disciples to seek safety in flight, to flee to the next town. And in Acts 14, we have the account of Paul and Barnabas sharing the gospel with the citizens of Iconium, and eventually they learned that a number of both Jews and Gentiles were planning to stone them. Well, they did not stick around to see if this was actually the case, or for that matter, to see if God would supernaturally intervene. They packed up their suitcases, paid the motel bill, and ran. And then there was a time shortly after Paul's conversion in Damascus. Paul learns of how a number of Jews there were conspiring to kill him. And he learns about the plan. So his buddies in the dark of the night, you know the story. They find an opening in the city wall and lower him down in a basket where he escapes to Jerusalem. So we have situations like this, escaping death, all through the book of Acts. And you might even remember from past December here when we worked through the account of Christ's birth on Matthew's Gospel. Something should trigger your memory there. Warned by an angel, Joseph and Mary fled Bethlehem and quickly headed toward Egypt. Now, one particular passage is quite interesting. It's found at the beginning of the 8th chapter of Acts. And we are told that immediately after Stephen was stoned, on the very same day, a great persecution broke out against the church in Jerusalem. And all the believers did what? They took off, scattered throughout Judea and Samaria, all except who? Who remembers? You guys ever read the book of Acts? Who remembers? All but the apostles. They stayed in Jerusalem. So no comment is made on whether the apostles were right or wrong to stay, or whether the other believers were right or wrong to flee. Luke's just giving an account of what happened. And it kind of leaves us here with the conclusion that neither one was outside God's will. And so this is always something to hold in the back of our minds. A day might come when this will be a serious discussion. Not now, but at some point it might be. Endure or flee. And if so, obviously we'll need to reach out to the Lord for wisdom. Now, a while back, earlier in the series, you might remember that I shared with you that soon after Bill Clinton was elected back in 1992, I started making plans to move to that small Central American country named, who remembers the country? Belize, yeah. I was serious about this. I was convinced that under Clinton's administration, our country was going to collapse and that Christians would be vigorously pursued. And at the time, I was young, impulsive, immature, and overly paranoid. I am now old. I'm not all that impulsive, a bit more mature, and not paranoid enough. But yet I do feel this way now about Joe Biden. and I have great uneasiness that under him or as vice president, we're probably going down. But back then I had learned that some Christians, fearful as well, were heading to Belize. And the more I heard about all that, well, the more that option became appealing. And Belize was a favorite because they had no extradition agreement with the U.S., at least at that time. They all spoke English. That was a big plus. And it was a Catholic country, and abortion was illegal, and, the advantages of that kind of thing. So I bought maps of Belize and books and watched movies filmed in Belize and started to fall in love with the place, the oppressive heat, the bugs. That didn't sound like much fun, but it would be worth it just to get away from the radical agenda of Bill Clinton and the heavy hand of Janet Reno. Remember her? I mean, that was the reason to move to Belize. Of course, money was an issue. I failed to get any traction on that, and so I eventually had to give up on the idea, which proved to be a good thing because I had a friend that did go, and the whole thing was a complete disaster. He moved his family back after moving them there and ended up losing tens of thousands of dollars in the process, and it was just a mess. And so packing up and taking off is no small matter. For us in this room, if that day were to ever come, the big question would be, where would we even go? I had lunch this past Monday with a Lutheran pastor, an Eastern Orthodox priest, and another Protestant pastor, all at the same table together. And the two liturgical guys were making the case that Russia was the place to go. Russia? But the more they talked about it, the more they had good reasons to back it up. I'm still not convinced, but they were Russia. So recently, I have actually heard that Northeast Indiana, of all places, is attracting people from both the east and west coast because it is Christian friendly and politically conservative. And so maybe we just happen to be in a good spot after all. And again, if this day were to ever come, may the Lord give us wisdom. That's probably the best I can say about this whole issue. All right, along with enduring it, fleeing from it, what about the option of fighting against it? And sometimes I wonder if I'm in the right church. Who said that? All right. This, I would think, would come down to what do you mean by fighting and to what purpose? All right, so let's get serious here. If you mean defending yourself through the legal process, like reaching out to your senator for help, or more likely seeking relief in the courts, well, of course, on this we would be on solid ground. This is a right, privilege that's been afforded to the citizens of this country, and we even see Paul invoking this privilege, this right, when standing before the governor Festus, as he asserts his Roman citizenship and appeals to Caesar. And I think all of us do realize this is an option and one that we have every right to take advantage of, and we may even at times be morally obligated to, so as to protect others who might be pursued unjustly in a similar way. And a recent example of this would be churches in California who asked the courts to step in to overturn the governor's order that prohibited church gatherings. So yes, fighting in this regard is certainly an option, at least in some situations. But even in the courts, the objective should be protection and relief, not punishment, as in seeking punitive damages. Now, if by fighting you mean swords, guns, violence, well, I think that would be a whole lot harder to justify. We just don't find any New Testament example for it or a case that could be made for it. On a practical level, using physical force, like against our government, won't work because they simply have more guns and the ones that they have are bigger than ours. And when it comes to persecution from individuals or organizations, well, again, what kind of physical force response would we be talking about? Like vandalism, inflicting personal injury on others, taking human life? There, again, we don't have examples in the New Testament to support this in the face of persecution, much less instructions or exhortations on it. And then it is here where people like to bring up the American Revolution and the freedom of religion that our founding fathers fought for with physical force, violence. Was that a justifiable war? Was that taking up of arms against the army of King George something that God approved of, intended? Someone's probably wanting to ask that question today during the Q&A. Fortunately, Dave Stevens will be addressing that in his next sermon, so I'll let him handle that. He's shaking his head. I thought we talked about that. What? That's my way of saying, I don't want to talk about the American Revolution. Don't bring it up during the Q&A time. All right, instead of killing others, let's first try to evangelize them, which brings us to the next point. Let's take a couple minutes now to talk about how persecution can provide opportunities for evangelism. Much could be said here. We have lots of examples from the book of Acts and from church history itself. Oftentimes, non-Christians are intrigued by not just the message the believer is standing by and suffering for, but also by his or her willingness to suffer for it, and to the extent to which they will suffer. One of the most, you'll know this, one of the most intense periods of persecution was from that last part of the first century to the early part of the third century. You have about a 250-year period there of much hardship, suffering, leaving behind many, countless martyrs of the faith. But nonetheless, historians have noted that by the end of the second century, there were an estimated 2 million believers in the Roman Empire. And to this rapid growth of Christianity, which is amazing, the ancient church father Tertullian remarked, "We multiply when you reap us. The more you mow us down, the fuller the harvest. The blood of the martyrs is seed of the church." Now, whether persecution always results in new converts could probably be debated, but we can say that it always opens up doors for sharing the gospel. And this is evident on just about every page in the book of Acts. So let's now bring it to home. Let's entertain a possible modern day scenario that any of us here could easily face, or something similar. Let's just bring it down to rural America in 2021. So we're not talking about being thrown to the lions or imprisonment or anything like that. A likely scenario is that someone, somewhere, could very well say to any one of us something like, "I can't believe anyone today would still be so backward, so hateful, that they would oppose same-sex marriage. Adults should be able to love whoever they want to without being judged." Okay, so you feel the pressure, you feel like, you're going to be a complete idiot, hateful guy if you don't sign on to this. So probably this has already been said to many here, or something similar. You could substitute even cohabitation or adultery or transgenderism or any number of hot button topics. Usually, unfortunately, Christians just sort of let the comment go. In the name of not wanting to be confrontational, they just kind of smile and let the claim go unchallenged. And when they do respond, it typically goes something like this: "Well, I'm a Christian and we just don't believe in that kind of thing," furthering the notion that Christians are backwards, ignorant, and judgmental. Or they might say, "Well, I was raised to believe that homosexuality is wrong." So in that, you're kind of admitting that you never thought about it yourself, and the way you were raised could actually be questioned. may actually be wrong. Or you might say, well, on this we just have to agree to disagree, as though there is no truth on the matter, and if there is, well, nobody can determine it. So with these kinds of responses, we let a great opportunity slip right through our fingers, and it's really sad when this happens. Now, personally, I would have a strong temptation to challenge the statement, we should just let people love whoever they want to, by providing examples where that obviously isn't the case. We don't let 40-year-old men love 12-year-old girls. And I would love to dive into that argument. But even that response, in most situations, would be to dribble away the opportunity. As ambassadors of Christ, the goal, it would seem, is to draw the person into a conversation about the gospel, which should start with the person Jesus, and not with our opinions about the issue itself or clever arguments for or against this or that. The issue at hand is simply a springboard we use to dive into the claims of Christ, the gospel. And so one possible response could look something like this. Well, now that you brought the subject up, I would be one of those who don't support same-sex marriages. I know there are arguments for and against, but for me, I'm just going with what Jesus said. The anticipated response, as you can visualize here, could be either, well, why would you do that? Why would you adopt his position? Which is a great way to get into all that business about who Jesus claimed to be and the reasons those claims are believable. Or they might respond with, well, what did Jesus say about that? Which is another great lead-in and opens up the discussion of why his teachings on any subject should be taken seriously, have any weight. These are discussions, these are questions that we are eager to get into, or should be willing, or should be eager to get into them. Anytime something like this comes up, and we are being pressured to think like the other person thinks, or we will be belittled, a good tactic is to simply put the onus on Jesus, which then opens up the door in explaining why he is the one to believe in. So when it comes down to it, our opinion on the matter is irrelevant. It doesn't matter what you think or what I think about this or that. What counts is what Jesus thinks about it. So on any of these controversial subjects, our goal then is to put that pebble in their shoe, as Greg Koukl likes to talk about, something that will kind of trouble them, something that they will have to think about for several days and, can't get out of their mind, try to resolve. Jesus said this about that. And so the only question now is whether what he said is worth anything. And all this leads into that whole business about his ministry, his mission, his teachings, his promises, his commandments, his claims and miracles, and why he was crucified, and the reports about his resurrection, and why all that is actually believable. And if true, what that means. What that means to the person you're talking to. What that means to everyone. And so if they are open to the truth, they will engage you on it. If not, then actually, as we know, there's no use in pushing it any further. So as you can see here, the objective isn't to win an argument on the issue at hand. The focus is not on same-sex marriage or transgenderism or adultery or open marriage or whatever. The goal at this level isn't to win any argument. All you want to do is to get them thinking about whether Jesus is who Christians claim he is, whether he is who he claimed to be. If they eventually come to Christ, then they too will see that his word on any subject is final. And so, as you know, our job is to simply lay out the facts, frame the questions, and it is, of course, the Holy Spirit who illumines the heart and enables the person with grace to respond. True? Everyone tracking with me on this? The point is, conflicts with our culture, including those times that we are subject to insult and harassment, are often terrific opportunities to launch into big questions that lead into the gospel itself. And while each of us needs to be equipped in apologetics so as to walk people through such discussions, we don't have to be world-class experts. Sometimes the appropriate response is to simply say, look into it yourself. Who did Jesus claim to be? If he rose from the dead, then those claims would be true, right? Check it out and see if the reasons for his resurrection are believable. And we'll talk more about it later. Let me know if I can help. A couple more examples, and then we'll take questions. I'm trying to drag this sermon out as long as I can so that there won't be time for questions. Another possible response. Well, I could very well be backward and ignorant, but if so, then so is Jesus. Like everything else, my position on the matter comes from him. It's not me, it's him. Or, I really wish I could share your position on that. It would make things a whole lot easier for me, but what do I do with, this radical prophet 2,000 years ago and what he said about it? What do I do with that? It's not me, it's him. So, that I think is the better way to approach these sorts of things. And we're probably going to see a lot more opportunities along this line in the days and months and years to come.